Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamani. This week, let's talk about the irrationality of defensive gun ownership. In November, I'm going to be attending a workshop at Saint Anselm's College in New Hampshire on the ethics, law, and social science of self-defense and firearms. It looks to be a really great group of scholars coming together. And rather than talking about my specialty, which is gun culture 2.0 in its normal aspects, I thought I would present some work that I have been developing since I've been involved in the field of gun studies, which is to try to systematize the dominant approach to gun culture 2.0 among scholars other than myself. And the dominant approach is what I call in this paper that I'll be presenting the standard model of explaining the irrationality of defensive gun ownership. And I think that there is underlying all of the various studies of defensive gun ownership that are taking place in psychology, political science, sociology, public health, an underlying model or framework for understanding defensive gun ownership. And the bottom line is that that model sees defensive gun ownership as irrational. Now, the standard model has a 6-point structure. And so over the next 5 weeks before I present at this workshop, I'm going to be presenting a part of that argument in the standard model each week for the next 5 weeks. This week, I just want to give a broad overview of the entire structure of the argument, and I'll leave the details to later. So the first point in the standard model of the irrationality of defensive gun ownership recognizes the reality of gun culture 2.0. So it recognizes the existence of defensive gun culture as being the core of gun culture today. The second point then discounts the need for and utility of guns for self-defense. So it takes my point, which is the existence of gun culture 2.0, but it argues that there's no real practical need or utility for guns in self-defense within this gun culture. So in fact, point 3 holds that the opposite is true of guns. Rather than making people safer through self-defense, they actually make people more at risk of accidental death and injury, suicide, and homicide. So the fourth point is therefore, defensive gun ownership is not rational, but irrational, right? It doesn't lower someone's risk. It actually increases people's risks in contrast to what people actually think they're doing when they get firearms for self-defense. Okay, point 5 is that starts to look at if guns are not owned for rational reasons, what are the reasons why people actually own guns? So there's some other reason other than actually defending themselves that lead defensive gun owners to own guns. And so scholars from sociology and political science have a particular view of what this is. Among them are downward economic mobility, stereotypical or toxic masculinity, and racism or racial resentment. Those are the true drivers of defensive gun ownership, not the desire to actually defend oneself, or not the rational desire to actually defend oneself. Point 6 is similar to point 5, but looks at the issue from the perspective of psychologists rather than political scientists or sociologists. And psychologists define the something else that's actually driving defensive gun ownership as a coping mechanism. So people face psychological threats in their everyday life, not actual physical threats, but psychological threats, and defensive gun ownership is a way of coping with those threats. And asterisk, see above, it's actually a maladaptive coping mechanism because addressing the psychological threats people are feeling, they're actually introducing more actual threats in their life from negative outcomes with firearms. and at the same time not making themselves any safer in actual self-defense situations. So that's the standard model of the irrationality of defensive gun ownership in 6 points. Again, in coming weeks, I'll address these points individually, so stay tuned for that.